Before we move on, a reminder, do check out the Sophie Ridge on Sunday podcast. It features the best bits of our interviews each week, plus analysis from me and my producer, Matt Lavender. It's available from lunchtime on the Sky News app, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so do check that out. Now, Labour is today calling for the debt built up by businesses during the pandemic to be treated like student debt. Now, to talk about that and more, we're joined by the Shadow Chief Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. Keen to talk about your business plan, but first, if I may, I'm keen to start on schools. We're just talking to Anne Longfield there about the impact on children that the pandemic has had. The government wants schools to return from March the 8th. Does that need to be all schools, or would you be happy if primary schools, for example, or schools in some regions went in first?
Well, the government does need to be very much guided by all of the science and the data that's made available to them. But absolutely, schools should be the first to open, which should be a real priority for the government to make sure that our children can get back to school. I mean, all parents will have seen the impact that being out of school for many children, or the disruption to education that's been caused, particularly for the most vulnerable children. You know, the fact that children can't play with their friends in the same way anymore. You know, the educational impact has been severe, but yes, we do absolutely need to see children, all children, back in school as quickly as possible. That just does need to be done safely.
Say that all children should be back in school as quickly as possible, that it should be done safely. I mean, that is exactly what we'd hear from Dominic Raab a few moments ago as well. Should all schools and all year groups go back at the same time, or would you be happy to see a staggered approach?
Well, the government does need to consider the advice that they receive, and it may be necessary to stagger that, but we will work with the government to make sure that it's done in a careful, considered way. But we do also need to see a much clearer plan set out from the government around supporting children to catch up on the missed learning that they've had to experience, but also making sure, as you heard just earlier from the Children's Commissioner, that we look at all of the impacts on children's well-being overall, because it has been a really difficult time. Children have lost out such a great deal, but we do need to make sure that when they go back, it's as safe as possible.
So if the scientific advice is that it would be safer to, for example, allow younger children to return first, or to allow some year groups like those taking exams to return first, you'd be happy with that?
We'll look at what the government says, but of course the government should be guided by the data and the science that's available, and we'll look carefully at what they set out. It should be done in a measured way. I think parents and teaching staff will understand it has to be done carefully and following the best possible advice.
OK. Now, we understand that Labour wants to allow businesses who have built up debt during the pandemic, I'm sure a lot of businesses that applies to, for that to be treated like student debt. Just explain the idea to us.
We know that so many businesses have had a really, really tough year. I've heard from so many of them that they're really starting to find that debt mountain they've built up hard to deal with, and they need breathing space to get through this crisis. So we don't believe that businesses should be paying back money that they've needed to borrow until they're in a much stronger position and until they're growing again. We know that in this country we've had the worst economic crisis of any major economy, and as right now, going into the next months ahead, 850,000 businesses are at risk, and that puts 2.5 million jobs on the line. We need to see urgent action from the government now to deal with that. They can't wait until the budget. They need urgent action from the Chancellor to help them get through this time.
Some businesses, of course, may never be able to pay off the amount of debt that they have built up during this unbelievable year. So under your plan, could that debt be written off and effectively covered by the taxpayer in the same way that it is with student loans?
Well, it's more likely that some of that debt will be written off if we don't take action now, because businesses, many of them, particularly smaller businesses, are just drowning under this debt, and they need to see real concerted action from the government. Of course, some businesses are in a stronger position, particularly some of those larger businesses, and we take a different approach there. But, we've been listening to business. We know that they will be driving the recovery that we need to see, the growth that we need to see in job creation. So we need to be working with them to make sure that the solutions that we put in place don't see good businesses going bust because of short-term decision-making.
So it could be written off, is the answer?
Well, unless we take action, debt will be written off, that's for sure. So putting in place a plan that allows businesses to deal with this in a far more manageable way would be a responsible way to be approaching this. Businesses just don't understand why the Chancellor hasn't got to grips with the crisis that they're facing. He isn't listening. We also need to see, I believe, a smart furlough introduced to support businesses to get through this. We also believe that the extension of the business rates holiday should continue, but also to see that further extension of the VAT cut. You know, so many businesses have found this a real struggle over the course of the last year, and if they go bust, it will make our recovery so much harder.
OK. Of course, all of these plans will cost money or take money as well. We've seen the worst fall in GDP since the invention of GDP this week, and many would like to see the Chancellor start to rebalance the books, if you like, when he gives the budget in March. Now, Keir Starmer said this week that over the course of the recovery, tax rises are not the right way to go. So are there any tax rises that Rishi Sunak could propose in the budget that you would support?
You'll struggle to find an economic expert who believes that right now we should be raising taxes on families, whereas, in fact, the Chancellor is doing precisely that with his council tax hit. If we pressed ahead with tax rises now, that would pull demand out of our economy. It would mean that families have got less money to spend in our shops and high streets, and it would damage the recovery that I think we all want to see. You know, we are at a fork in the road now. We want to see Britain come back strongly and to emerge from this terrible, terrible pandemic that we've experienced. But if the Chancellor presses ahead with tax rises, not only will it hurt families, but it will be economically illiterate. And as I say, you'd struggle to find anybody right now who's saying that tax rises on families are the right way to be going about this.
I'm not talking about tax rises on families specifically. Are there any tax rises that Rishi Sunak could propose that Labour would support?
Now, absolutely isn't the time to be pressing ahead with tax rises. That isn't an approach that we would support.
OK, thank you. Now, I just want to talk to you a little bit about Labour. 116,000 people have now died after testing positive for COVID. We've seen the biggest economic hit since the Great Frost in 1709. And yet the Conservatives have actually managed to extend a poll lead over Labour. They're leading Labour in the polls. Lots of people will be looking at that thinking, why isn't Labour doing better in the circumstances?
Well, a little over a year ago, we suffered one of the worst general election defeats in our history, so we always knew that it was going to take a long time to regain the trust of the British people once more. But I think we've made tremendous progress over the course of that time under Keir Starmer's new leadership. If you'd said to me in December 2019 that we would have made the progress we've made already, I would have taken off your right arm to have been making such fantastic progress. But of course, you know, after such a terrible defeat, it will take time to regain the trust of the British people once more. We've always been clear about that. But at the same time, I think there is an expectation from the British people that we're constructive in the opposition that we put to the government. This is a crisis like no other, so we have pushed the government and given voice to the concerns that we've had, not least on the economic recovery, where because we've had the worst economic crisis of any major economy, we face a very difficult path back. And that's because going into this crisis, the country was built on weak economic foundations. But, you know, we're making great progress. Of course, as a party, there is more to do.
OK, some on the left of the party are getting a little bit jittery. People like John McDonnell, like the Unite Union, wanting to see a June emergency conference to try and address some of their concerns. Now, those on the left, I guess, would like you to take a few more risks, to call for things that aren't just going to happen anyway, to differentiate between Labour and the government. Is the problem that Labour at the minute is just a bit boring?
Well, no, we're years out from an election, so of course we'll set out very detailed policy that rises to the challenge that Britain faces at that point. But we are in the middle of a pandemic after all, and we absolutely have to be focused on getting the country through this crisis. But we have made tremendous progress as a party. But, you know, when I think back to that terrible election defeat in December 2019, the first priority for us as a party had to be earning the right to be heard once more by the British people. We've done that. I think Keir Starmer has demonstrated that he is a Prime Minister, next Prime Minister for this country. He's ready to do that job. And there is genuine and real enthusiasm from people that I speak to about the progress that Labour has made. Of course, there is still much more that we need to do. We always knew it would be a tough road ahead. OK, thank you for coming on the show. It looks very picturesque and snowy where you are, but a bit chilly as well, so I hope you've got a nice cup of tea somewhere standing by. And thank you for being on. Thank you.